There you go. There we go. Good.
Wonderful. You know, Stefanie and I have known each other for a long, long time. Where are you, Stefanie?
She's
There she is. Okay. And it pleases me no end to know that she eventually became the executive director of JVP, which she is now. And we're very, very, very fortunate to have Stefanie able and willing to talk with us today, because JVP is a member of the Kairos Puget Sound Coalition. At least 2 chapters are members, the Seattle chapter and the Tacoma chapter, under the leadership of Sally Shaw. So it was absolutely delightful to know that Stefanie would be willing to speak to us. And I don't want to say any more. I want to give her all the time that she deserves to have to tell us what she has on hand. And you all have her title on the PowerPoint that you got, which is, see if I've got it here. Safety through solidarity, working together to win justice for all. And I present to you Stefanie Fox.
Thank you, Huda. It's an honor to be introduced by you. Good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to see you all. I wish we were, as is customary now, we say, I wish we were in person, but this is how we get to see each other these days. Though I am your neighbor here, I'm in Beacon Hill in Seattle. So I am delighted to get to be talking with friends, some of you long old friends, some new neighbors in this struggle for justice to get to be together in. And Huda and Mary asked me to kind of just prepare some thinking, offer some thinking about the moment that we're in, and share a little bit about how Jewish Voice for Peace is thinking about our work and thinking about the work we all share together as part of this movement. And I wanted to bring some thoughts about that today, and I look forward to maybe some Q&A at the end to get into it and hear a little bit more about what you all are up to. But Jewish Voice for Peace, as you know Sally, our Seattle and Tacoma chapters. We've got chapters all across the country. And, Rabbinical Council, where we've become quite a big national force of Jews and friends of Jews who are fighting for justice and equality and dignity for all people, no exceptions. And that in particular to us, of course, means justice for Palestinians. And, we're looking at this moment that we're all in as quite a crossroads moment, right? So you can think about the last 4 years and the intensity of the last year in particular, and the way that we've definitely seen the rise and the ascendance of many, terrifying right-wing, authoritarian, fascistic governments, whether what we've seen here in the US itself, in Israel, of course, in Brazil, in India, and the way that those the governmental and populist power of those right-wing forces have sort of unleashed horrible violence and really, destabilized democratic processes, destroyed the planet. We know that it's been a terrifying time, and that march has continued unabated. And we've also seen on the other side of that, the ascension of grassroots popular movements that we're all a part of, right? Fighting for justice and equality, looking to build a world that we all live in with dignity and freedom. And so the kind of, that has risen also and seen an amazing ability to kind of push back against the rise of those forces. And so we really do look at this crossroads moment that the whole planet is facing. And certainly when we look at Israel-Palestine and the US's role, that we see the opportunity to choose the path of justice together and to really fight this other road that's so grim. And I think, being in the COVID era has underscored that. We obviously see the ways that COVID has not just itself been this I don't need to explain to any of you the year that we've all just collectively been enduring, but I also like to look at it as a really massive unveiling of the pre-existing conditions of racism and injustice that exist and plague our society long before COVID, hit, and that the way that the pandemic has coexisted and driven into those fissures and made inequality greater, made racism greater. And in the case of Israel-Palestine, of course, we see that the apartheid regime is then enacted in the midst of a pandemic as medical apartheid, right? We understand that Jewish Israelis have access and have been vaccinated at record rates, while Palestinians in the same land are in overrun hospitals with skyrocketing COVID rates and facing absolute inaccess to those same vaccines in spite of even a surplus that Israel has. And so we see that as medical apartheid, right? So the manifestation of those systems of inequality showing up through the public health crisis that we're all living through. And, if you zoom back even beyond COVID and you look at Israel-Palestine in particular, we really understand the last 4 years not to have been the beginning of injustice. I think none of us in this room would say that injustice started with Trump or with Netanyahu's reign in Israel, but we do understand the ways that the last 4 years of unrelenting attacks on Palestinian rights from the Israeli government, and really the way that they've been able to bask in the impunity that Trump allowed, right? And so we've seen that Trump-Netanyahu alliance allowed for Israel to, expropriate and steal more Palestinian land and water, than in decades, enforced and even clamped down even further racist and discriminatory laws, cementing on the ground de facto annexation, a one-state reality of apartheid in that land, right? We know that the tightening of what the UN already called a medieval siege in Gaza has only increased. We understand that there's been the largest destruction of Palestinian homes and expansion of settlements in decades. And so we see that on the ground, things are worse than ever. And we also see the way that in some ways this past 4 years has been, as I was saying, sort of a mask off, right? So I think that the way that for the US, people were like, we see what Trump is doing, and we see this Trump-Netanyahu alliance, and look at what is clearly apartheid on the ground. There's been an unveiling and an unmasking that has also meant a kind of flourishing of these grassroots movements that say, justice for all, that say, absolutely, we will stop exceptionalizing Palestinian rights as though we can leave that out of conversations about what is progressive, and insist that that's at the center of a broad progressive agenda that fights for justice and dignity for all people. And I think that in the US, we saw in one sense a very successful coalition come together to boot out Trump, and to, we formed Jewish Voice for Peace Action in order to fight in this past election cycle and, defend the few champions that we had seen make it into Congress who were willing to stand up for Palestinian rights. And, the calculus has always been that the cost of speaking out that Palestinians deserve full human and civil rights has been that you can, you'd be persona non grata in Congress, right? That you would be kicked right back out. Well, what we've seen, and we've been able to be a part of a movement demonstrating, is that political calculus is shifting as the masks are coming off and people are understanding truly that if we have progressive values, they apply here and around the world, that we've seen that actually we're building a reward system for bravery on Palestine and Palestinian rights, right? That the Rashida Tlaib and AOC and Ilhan Omar, faced millions of dollars poured in to get them out of office because of their willingness to speak the simple truth. And in fact, they won by far greater margins than they had in their first elections. And they're entering back into the 117th Congress with a deeper, bigger mandate than ever, right? And so in those ways we've seen, and we managed to get Trump out, and Palestinians and Palestinian rights supporters were a key part of that coalition. We also understand that as that progress marches forward in the US, that there's always going to be backlash, right? So we see, Zionist organizations fighting back ever harder to re-entrench their authority to continue the US status quo of support for Israeli injustice. We also see, for instance, in the US context, of course, the horrifying, US insurrection. We saw Nazi flags and Confederate flags marching through the Capitol. We've seen horrifying murders and assaults on every community targeted by white supremacy. And we know that just because Trump is out of office, the half of the country that, that has supported him and put him in office and far predated him is only incensed and provoked by that loss. And frankly, the work to fight them back is just getting started. And so in the context of all of that, of course, it is this incredibly important time to understand that our safety, our ability to be safe in the face of those threats is all about how we come together and we say we will show up for one another. Our communities all matter. We must protect each other. We must insist on US and foreign policy that holds those same values and that upholds those same values. But we know that's where we are. We know that's what it takes, but we also have to understand that the Biden administration is no dream come true, right? That here, why we are in this crossroads moment, that anybody with a human beating heart looking at the situation should say, here is this march of fascistic, authoritarian, racist governments and populist movements around the world. Here is a rising progressive tide saying all people matter and equality for everyone. And then what do we get in office, but especially on the matter of Israel-Palestine, an attempt to roll back and wind back the clock and to try to say, oh, the Trump-Netanyahu thing was one thing, but we're going to just wind that clock back and say it's the 11th hour for the two-state solution. And actually, if we just return to Obama era norms, we'd be just fine. Everything would be okay on the ground in Palestine, and so what that means functionally in terms of everything we've seen from the Biden administration is in top line messaging, in policy initiatives, and everything that they've done in terms of appointments, we see a top goal of shielding Israel from accountability. And that is what the status quo in this country has always been across both sides of the aisle. And so you see the Biden administration saying, oh, the International Criminal Court is announcing that they are going to actually investigate possible war crimes in Palestine since 2014. Don't worry, the US will promise to block that, right? Oh, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The spread of this movement has grown and grown so that we have, a massive nonviolent, unarmed movement for justice in the tradition of every social justice movement in recent memory. No, we will say that's anti-Semitic. It can't be touched. It shouldn't happen. The US government gives the most money in US aid that funds directly US in Israeli injustice. And suddenly legislators are starting to talk about accountability through even the conditioning of those funds. Biden's administration says absolutely not, right? And so we see that time after time after time, there's this line being drawn in the sand saying, we can wring our hands or we can maybe talk about how it's tough for Palestinians, but absolutely no will we allow for any kind of accountability to be brought around the US's role in supporting Israeli injustice and around Israel's actions as regards to Palestinians. And then as a part of that strategy, we see the furthering of what we talk about as weaponization of anti-Semitism. So at a moment when, as I'm saying, there's Nazi flags in the Capitol, when as a Jewish person, it is quite clear to me that our communities, just like Asian communities and Black communities and Palestinian and Arab communities in this country are under threat. that there is a great need for dismantling of oppression and a dismantling of anti-Semitism along with all of those other forms of oppression. The harnessing of that justifiable and important concern and the use of it as a weapon against Palestinians and Palestinian rights. And that is a long-time tactic, right, to support Israeli impunity, but we see it ramping up and growing. And so you may have heard of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. Some people call it the IHRA or IRA definition. I want to just read to you the definition. You might hear a lot about it, but sometimes we don't talk about what's really in it. So I wanted to take just a minute to do that. It's a very short and quote unquote working definition. And that is just, it says, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So at face, it's not quite the definition I would write of anti-Semitism. It's a little vague and obscure, and it doesn't do a lot. But the primary problem with it is not what's their bolded definition, but the fact that they then offer 11 examples. They say, this is understandably kind of a vague statement. We'll give you 11 examples of then what you should look for as anti-Semitism, which, for the record, there's no other form of oppression that has in law 11 examples that you're looking for to determine. That's not how we actually do work to end discrimination and end oppression, right? But so there's 11 examples, and of those 11, 7 of them are about Israel. And so if you look at it, you can understand that it's crafted and drafted and deployed in the world quite intentionally to conflate efforts to hold Israel accountable or efforts to advocate for Palestinian human rights with hatred toward Jews. And that conflation is incredibly damaging, both to the fight for Palestinian rights, of course, and also to the real fight to dismantle anti-Semitism. And we see it taking hold the world over. You know, in Europe, like, soccer clubs adopted as their definition of anti-Semitism. We see it, and we see it in the US, you know, sort of marching forward, it being going to be introduced in state legislatures. Will the Biden administration adopt it? And there's a very clear campaign to use it as a tool in, yet again, the same bottom line goal of Israel maintaining full impunity. And so, you know, what can we do in the face of all of this? What is our task, right? And what we think about is an absolute refusal to turn back that clock, right? We must insist on picking up the fight from where we are, of understanding that the last 4 years and the last year have deepened oppression, not just in the US, but certainly in Israel-Palestine, and that we must pick up the fight from where we are. And that means that in Congress, in our communities, that we continue to fight for mechanisms that create accountability for injustice. So BDS is obviously a very powerful way to do that. JVP continues to be a proud member of the BDS movement, so to speak, a campaigner in that broad global fight for Palestinian rights through the tactics of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And we also think there is really profound work that can happen in Congress, as I mentioned, with the new opportunities in front of us. Just last week, Representatives Tlaib and Pocan put out a letter, I don't know if folks saw this, but a letter to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken with some of the most powerful language we've ever seen coming out of Congress. You know, the letter names that Israel's ongoing settlement expansion in the West Bank is ongoing colonization. It calls it settler colonialism. It talks about accountability for annexation, vaccine availability under medical apartheid. It talks about the need for an end to home demolitions and child detention. And that's just one of like 2 or 3 letters that were released last week. We also see the opportunity potentially for proactive legislation that aims to condition military aid potentially. And certainly we don't expect that legislation to win this year, but those are fights we have the opportunity to help wage as constituents and ensure that our electeds are fighting for those same values that we hold dear. And so for us at JVP, we use a couple of filters to know that the work that we're doing with Congress sort of comports with this vision I'm talking about. And those two things we look for are, I share them with you in case they might be helpful as you all set your legislative plans as well. One being that that whatever is being put forward actually puts people first, puts Palestinian human beings on the ground first, rather than a conversation about political solutions or a security framework, which is often what Congress always says is, oh, to preserve the two-state solution, we'll do X, or for actually Israel's security in the world, we'll do Y. And we look for legislation or vehicles that put human beings in the center and human rights and international law as the basis. And then the second thing we look for is, like I've been talking about a lot, accountability. Is this a hand-wringing measure, which we know the Democrats in particular are very comfortable doing, saying we see injustice, but oh, this is rough, we don't like this, oh, we condemn this. But does it say, actually, as a country that gives $3.8 billion a year to Israel, what are we saying that our accountability measures are that we're actually putting in place when we see these human rights abuses on the ground? And so we look for those things. And we hope that we can actually move forward and make some progress in Congress and kind of continue to shift the conversation together toward eventual real accountability. And then finally, I would just say that, you know, as a community and a movement of churches in particular, thinking.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great.
And I've got the chat on everybody it'll go to you, Ed, now. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
I was just going to finish up to say, you know, I think that as a Jewish organization, you know, as we see the rise in anti-Semitism and racism in this country and around the world, you know, we would invite you as our church partners to think about, you know, where do we look to unroot real anti-Semitism, to unroot racism in all of our communities, right? And where do we stay super clear-eyed about the attempts to weaponize those real concerns in the service of injustice? And so together, by showing up for one another and being really clear on our principles and really, really visionary together about the world that we're fighting for, where all people have equality, justice, and dignity, I really believe that we're at that moment where we can head down that path and really achieve those goals if we do so together. So I'm so happy to be here with you. Thanks for letting me take a little time to lay out what our vision is. And I would love if there's any questions, if we have time for them, Mary, I'm not sure, but thanks so much.
Yes. Thank you so much. Let's see, am I muted? No, I'm not. Good. So thank you so much, Stefanie. Inspiring. And it's so wonderful to have you as the executive director of JVP living here in Seattle. So we have
In our neighborhood, no less.
you can contact us. So let's see, we have no questions in the chat, but Ruth is raising her hand. And Ed, I'm turning this over to you now. Yeah, there you go. Unmute.
Okay. Yeah,
Ruth.
Ruth, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Yeah.
Unmute, please.
Okay, I guess 3 times makes it good. Thank you so much for your reflections about the situation that we're in now. It's really helpful. I have been I've been thinking a lot about the stories we tell ourselves and about how important it is this moment in time when we have an opportunity to really do something about the kind of white nationalism in our country and anti-Semitism and anti-Asian and the kind of thing that we sit on. And I think that when the crisis is, will we do something or not? And when JVP needs something, please call on us so that Mary can send out the alert and say, all hands on deck. And so we can support you. And I think the same thing for us. Let's really establish that communication so that we're on call for each other, like nurses or whatever. Good. One of the things that has struck me is the way in which the term anti-Semitism parallels cancel culture for the religious right. They talk about cancel culture, and I find it's practically wounding to hear, because you want to equalize voting rights for people. All of a sudden you're cancel culture. Well, but you're just trying to get at the racism that's at the foot of the difficulty voting. And so I think it's a time where minds are being challenged. There are a lot more fronts here for us to work on. And so thank you so much for your leadership. And we look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Ruth. And I feel like you just did a beautiful, when I say this sort of language of safety through solidarity, I think you just did a beautiful job of demonstrating it, right? It's just really about how obviously we move as political actors and we push Congress to insist on safety and equality and freedom for all people, but it's also just in a very human way how we show up for each other, And so I really feel that and appreciate that. I see, I had a couple of thoughts, but I see questions in the chat, and then maybe Mary or Huda, you're raising your hand. I can't quite tell.
I am Huda. And
Go.
Yep. So why don't you go, since you're actually seeing, Stefanie, the questions in the chat, why don't you go ahead and handle the couple that are in there, and then we'll get to Huda. How's that?
Great. That sounds great. So I'm seeing this question of like the proportion of US Jews who move with JVP values or with us as an organization. We have about 20,000 members across the country, member leaders, and then about 500,000 followers on our social media accounts, and 250,000 people on our email list. And not all the folks who follow us on social media are Jewish, obviously. Many of you probably do as well. But we have, we've seen polling recently, actually from J Street, that shows that for Jews under 45, I think it is, or under 40, about 1 in 5 support boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And we don't just see the movement among young Jews, we see it across generations, but certainly among young Jews. And we see really a sea change of opinion. And we're, we see ourselves as what we call a base building organization to help drive that change and bring more folks into to share our values and to say, to understand the ways that perhaps we've been raised to believe lies and myths about really what's happening. And I would also say, as a church community, for us at JVP, we really focus on bringing Jews into the movement and really ensuring that there's a Jewish voice, pushing back against the mainstream in our community. And it's also important to recognize that, there are far more Christian Zionists in this country than Jewish Zionists. There's far more Christian Zionist money driving US impunity than there is Jewish. And so there's a lot of work to bring, particularly white evangelical churches holding a lot of sway in terms of setting US policy. And so we also look at that and see you guys as partners in shifting, being peacemakers, being anti-racists, and bringing analysis, and also, the struggle for Palestinian freedom into your communities is so vital for that reason. I also see this question about how we differ from J Street, and then I see some if not now questions. So J Street, yes, J Street is, J Street sees itself as an organization that's advocating for the two-state solution is their their primary goal. And our framework is around human rights, equality, justice, and international law, and they're just different frameworks, right? We are saying, you know, Palestinian human rights are essential, that all people of Israel, Palestine should have equality and freedom in equal measure. And J Street is committed to a particular political solution. And so those are just really different agendas at the end of the day. And I would also say there's a bit of a difference in just that we are a base building organization. We also do a lot of congressional advocacy, of course, but we're looking to, you know, do political education and be really driven by the power of our membership. So we're also just like a little bit different in our approach and how we think about organizing. But certainly J Street, you know, has played an important role that I think no one would deny in shifting from the belief that AIPAC was the only voice on the Hill about what a political solution needed to look like. But I think also we're at a point now where the movement has grown, and the constellation of those of us in JVP or in other organizations saying, it's not about the two-state solution, it's about accountability, it's about the US's role in holding up injustice, and it's about, you know, simple one person, simple all people deserve the same basic human rights is, I think resonates and is a pretty undeniable common sense position that I think is only going to grow. And then I see questions about If Not Now. We are in touch. You know, If Not Now is an organization that started about 5 years ago that really focuses on young Jewish people and particularly challenging Jewish institutions and their role in, you know, sort of being moral cover for the occupation. And they have a focus that really, they've been focused on, you know, an end the occupation framework, which of course JVP supports an end to the occupation. We also understand and acknowledge, you know, that it is apartheid on the ground, and we're looking for, you know, full recognition of international rights with international law, which includes the right of return. So we have a different politic as well than If Not Now, but we move much more closely to If Not Now, and we have overlap, of course, and are friendly fellow travelers, even as there are sometimes differences, right? Any other questions?
Yes. I
Yeah.
have a question.
Yeah, Huda, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. You actually answered the first question I had, which is what our coalition of churches and maybe others could do. I'm hoping that when we listen to the recording of your talk, that this would come about as a mandate almost for what our churches can be doing in terms of pushing forward this agenda, this new agenda that you outlined. I wanted to ask you, I'm going to take my time and ask you and ask Amin also to come on board. Where are you, Amin?
He's here, he's over here.
Okay.
He's here.
To see if he has any questions for you as well. But I would like to ask you, what do you think of the one-state solution?
And do you want Amin to chime in and ask any questions?
No, after you answer, then
Okay.
Amin, please ask a question. I'm giving you your marching orders.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay.
You know, JVP organizationally does not take a position on one state, with the principled sort of position that we are trying to move the US out of the way of a just solution, that we say the US upholds Israeli impunity, as I'm talking about, and contributes to injustice on the ground, financially and in terms of legally standing in the way of accountability. And so we want to move the US out of the way, and we want to ensure that there could even be a ground for a just political solution. And what we say is that that would have to mean equality, justice, freedom, and dignity for all people in equal measure. Now, we also have a statement opposing Zionism directly as a Jewish organization, and understanding the foundations of the state and the Nakba are incredibly vital to JVP's political analysis. And so I think you could extrapolate from that we have pretty grim understandings of the prospects of the two-state solution. And we also understand the reality, the one-state reality that is existing in Israel today. And so, an equality framework, I think many of us individually would say, from an equality perspective, one equal state where all people are afforded the same rights certainly fits the bill that we say are our criteria, but we don't hold that as like a policy position that we're advocating for as our top goal, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Emily?
I mean, I'll turn it over to you and then I'll read the question in the chat. Yeah.
Well, I actually don't have a question. I just want to, I think you touched on everything, and can you hear me okay? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
okay?
Yeah,
I'm not
you
sure about
sound
that.
great.
Okay.
Good to see you.
No, I want to take this opportunity to say that I'm so happy to see you, Stephanie. I haven't seen you in
so
person
happy
for a
to
long
see
time, so
long.
I'm very happy to see you, and I can't wait to see you in person. I hope it's very soon. And I also thank you for your leadership. Thank you for all that you do, and whether as an individual or as a leader of JVP, and to thank JVP as a whole for all that you do to help us get to hopefully to the other side, where we can have justice and peace for all. And I'll again, I just can't wait for all of us to get there, and hopefully all of us get to that point together as a family who have been working for a very long time to get to that point of where we can achieve justice and peace for all. So thank you again. It's
so good to see you, Amin. Thank you for those words. That means so much to me. And I look forward to a catch up in person as soon as it's safe. Thanks so much. I see Andrew saying, have we created resources to help the Christian community understand our perspective on the damage Zionism does to the true fight against anti-Semitism and our perspective on human rights violations? We have many resources available. I would encourage folks to follow our social media on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We try to put out resources really regularly, both that we create, that Palestinian partners create. And I would also, I think that FOSNA's putting great resources out around Christian Zionism that we have been really delighted to see. And so, I think that's, we're at a lucky moment, I think, in the movement where there's really a proliferation of great educational resources. So yeah, definitely great to keep those flowing between us.
Stephanie, can you stay on to the end and listen to some of the reports that people have written up for this event for today?
Yes, I plan to stay until noon. My toddler may come bopping in here to the frame if it gets close to noon, but I'll stick around as long as he allows.
Yes, you'll get.
I just wanted to interject one follow-up to our question. There's something very unique about JVP's voice because it is a Jewish organization. And so the reason I asked that question about churches is that so many churches believe that they're supporting, when they're supporting Israel, they're supporting Jews. And I think that you guys have, by default, a unique perspective that can help educate Christians who believe they're doing the right thing, but they don't understand how much damage they really are doing. And I'm just curious if you guys have something that's specifically targeted for Christians who are maybe starting to deconstruct or starting to rethink their de facto support of Israel, because sometimes we have found that because churches and Christians here have been so conditioned to disregard the voice of Palestinians that and even other Christians, that they don't listen. And we're extremely thankful for your organization above all. I mean, I read so much of your guys' thing, your posts and your messaging. But I think you're in a unique position that sometimes you could produce something that is uniquely effective, where other organizations and groups just might not be able to break through.
Thanks for that. I'm sorry, what's your, I know that Andrew's next to you, but what?
Carrie.
Carrie.
Carrie, thanks,
Yeah.
Carrie. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that means a lot. I do think we have an important role to play. And there's always a dynamic too, where we're kind of like, in what ways, I think that this speaks a little bit to Ruth's point earlier about like even the definition, the word anti-Semitism. And it's very painful as a Jewish person, especially any Jewish person. It's very painful to see the way the word has been kind of stripped for its parts and used as a weapon when, real anti-Semitism has not been eradicated, and I think that that struggle, to dismantle anti-Semitism and racism is very alive, as we've been talking about this whole time. And so, I think that certainly when churches take on that work in earnest and say, where is the anti-Semitism in the way that we, in our liturgy or in our work, and where can we show up for our Jewish neighbors? That means a lot, especially in the face of actual anti-Semites who claim that their stance against Palestinian human rights makes them somehow immune from accusations of anti-Semitism. I mean, the world is just so upside down that you can have avowed, like QAnon supporting conspiracy theorist, anti-Semite racists who also support the aligned values of the Israeli government, who then somehow think they're immune from being called anti-Semitic because they support attacks on Palestinians. It's just the most outrageous thing. And so we do want to have a real voice in that. And we so appreciate your spreading the word for it. And we also, sometimes see the way in which, as a Jewish organization, like you said, folks will make room to hear our voices, but not even the voices of your Palestinian co-religionists, the Palestinian Christians or Palestinian Muslim, partners. And so we also want to make sure that, we're encouraging church communities both to listen to us because we think we have something to say, but also to ensure that you make room for the sometimes anti-racist work that's necessary to ensure that Palestinians can speak for themselves and in your communities and talk about their own experiences. So I think both are needed, but thank you so much for that, Carrie. I see.
And Stephanie, I think there are a couple questions in the chat box.
Yeah, great. So I see Carol. Yeah, we have a Facebook We Need to Talk campaign with about 50 or now 55 global partners that I encourage. It's under that same Facebook We Need to Talk.com web address, and I check it out. It's also in response to attempts to conflate. It's similar to the IHRA definition, but basically Facebook is looking to adopt a policy that would officially conflate use of the word Zionist with anti-Semitic hate speech, which of course, when you think about Palestinians describing their own experiences, saying a Zionist settler burned down my home, or Jews like me saying, I'm unlearning the myths of Zionism I grew up with, that being tagged as and flagged and taken down as hate speech is truly horrifying. And so we've got 50,000 plus signatures on the petition, and we've had a global day of action in 17 cities. And so we encourage you guys to take part in that campaign. You'd be very welcome. It's not a Jewish specific campaign. Please join us. As we continue to escalate it, I think that, there is with the question Carol's asking specifically of, do you think it'll happen? Will Facebook move forward with this? I think it's just important to name that, there is a shrinking of space for, of course, Palestinian rights advocacy, and primarily for Palestinians, that is really, really critical to keep an eye on as we think about advocacy, right? So Hamla is a really important digital rights focused organization out of Palestine. I would keep an eye on and lift up on your own social media, because they're continuing campaigns for other platforms that are doing the same, and really keeping an eye on the way that the Israeli government itself is seeking to foreclose the space online for Palestinians advocate for themselves and for those of us who want to join them in the fight. So that's a critical front in the battle, I think, for all of us. And especially if you think about, Gaza under siege in the time of COVID, if social media is cut off, how are we to know what is happening? How are Palestinians supposed to connect with and advocate for themselves on the ground? So it's critical. And Mary's asking if there's crossover with anti-racist movement. Absolutely. I think that intersectionally building, as I've been talking about, kind of progressive movement that that does not exceptionalize Palestine, that says, okay, the same values we apply to the way we think about incarceration in this country, or the way we think about healthcare or environmental justice, those same values apply when we're looking at what's happening in Israel-Palestine. And so I think that is grown tremendously in my 11 years at JVP, and I'm sure you've all seen that our movements are making these connections. And I think it's only more from here. And so, the same kind of message of show up, the way Ruth was saying, be there for the movements in our own communities, and knitting together, we're so much stronger. So it's really, really essential part of what we do. And Carol, keep in touch. We have great JVP members. Like, if you guys want to bring folks to your churches, or you want to think about other resources, of course, you can totally be in touch, would be great.
Yeah, John Berg just sent a question.
Great. Let's see. So talking about how Avram Berg speaking out against the nation state law in Israel, has JVP helped to publicize that statement? I know we've posted some articles about that, and we've been definitely speaking out forcefully against the nation state law. Does everybody know what the nation state law is? Yeah, so since it came out as really a concretization and a clarity of what of truly deeply making sure that inequality is baked into the law, and being able to speak about that. I think that was one of the kind of moments of, like I said, mask off in the last several years that have allowed for people to really see what's happening. And so, yeah, that I think that Avram Berg is just another example of folks who are finally kind of breaking with that silence and saying, oh no, I can't abide this anymore. Hank, do you have a question? You want to speak aloud?
Yes, Mary. Yeah, I have one. It's a little bit complex to write. Stefanie, I thought this was a magnificent presentation. I really appreciated it. I have referred to JVP many times with people because having a Jewish voice to speak out against what is happening, injustice, is so important. I mean, it's critical. And my question is, I do not understand the Jewish community in this country. I know AIPAC is off to one side and very vocal, but I guess they're a fairly small percentage, and I don't understand the Jewish community. I mean, there's the liberals and the Orthodox, and could you sort of break down the Jewish community in terms of how it relates to the problem we've been talking about? The Jewish community in the United States. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Jewish community, like any community, is complex and dynamic. I could talk for a long time about I'm not, there's a lot of aspects that could answer your question. I think, like I said earlier, I think that, JVP, since I've been at JVP, like I said, over a decade, I find that as soon as we're able to create the containers for organizing, and in other words, to kind of throw our arms open wide enough to say, come with us, fellow Jews, this is the path toward justice. I feel like the wider we can spread those arms, the people just come, the will and the willingness to show up and be part of this struggle, I think, is growing all of the time in the Jewish community across Like I said, there are patterns and polls that would show you that young Jews, Jews of color,
Votes now.
are particularly on the leading edge of that sea change, but I think it's across denominations and streams of Judaism and organizations. So it's kind of a complex question to answer, and I think that one thing I might say is that as a church leader, as a someone organizing inside Christian community, I would kind of flip the question back on you a little bit to say, I think there's a lot of opportunity for white Christians in particular to look at the role of especially white evangelical Christian Zionism in shaping US policy on a number of social issues, and of course on foreign policy as it relates to Palestine. And so I think that, really thinking about, I have questions about Christian community. I grew up here, I grew up in Gig Harbor, so I grew up around a lot more Christians than I did Jews. But I do have some well, there's a lot of work to do there. So I would encourage a little bit of internal looking too, if that makes sense.
And labeling is just not good in general.
Yeah.
I don't think it's not productive to label and put people in boxes.
Mm-hmm.
We're evangelical. Post evangelical maybe is the better term.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I don't know the ins and outs of, I think that we also talk about Christian Zionism. That means a lot of different things. There's many different kinds of Christians, you know what I mean? And so thinking about how do we unite together around common values, and also how do we all in our own corners really dig in and think about rooting out the racism and injustice that can be forwarded in our communities that all of us have to contend with. And so the opportunity for each of us to do that work in our own corners, and then to kind of meet in the middle and say, how's that going? How do I support you? How do I show up? Is really critical.
I'm going to call this, Stefanie, thank you so much. I'm conscious of the fact that it's almost 11:30 and we've got at least 12 or 13 reports, but we can have you come back.
I hope so.
Thank you guys. Thanks for the time. It's been lovely. I'll stick around while I hear some reports.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much,
Yeah,
Stephanie.
right. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go through and call upon people